All right, it's a pleasure to be talking here today. I am going to use New York City's stop, question, and frisk policy to illustrate two ways in which algorithms can be used to inform police practices, particularly in the context of bias. So the first way is through making better real-time decisions of whom to stop and whom not to stop. And the second way is algorithms can be used to audit past police actions in a way which I'll describe. So over the last decade, New York City residents were stopped and briefly detained millions of times in an effort to get weapons and contraband off the streets. And so a complaint about this tactic was that it was used indiscriminately with little focus for stopping those most likely to be engaged in crime. So there was another complaint, which was that there were great observed racial disparities in who was stopped. And this begs the question, how could one use an algorithm, or could one use a risk assessment tool to make better stops? So in some joint work with collaborators, we looked at over 750,000 police stops conducted between 2008 and 2012. This is all publicly available data released annually by the NYPD. So we looked at stops where the suspected crime was criminal possession of a weapon. This was the most frequently occurring category of stop. And we estimated the likelihood that somebody suspected of having a weapon would actually have a weapon, using all the information available to an officer, all the recorded information available to an officer before the stop was made. So we're inputting to an algorithm all the recorded aspects of a stop circumstances, location of the stop, demographics of the suspect that are available to an officer before the stop is made. We put it in an algorithm, it's a logistic regression, and the output is the probability that the suspect is in fact carrying a weapon. So how would you use an algorithm like this to make a decision? Well, one thing you could do is you could say, okay, well, you know, I'm an officer and I'm going to suspect the people who I was originally suspecting, and then I'm going to use this algorithm to compute the probability they're carrying a weapon, and if that probability is higher than some certain threshold, let's say higher than 5% or higher than 10%, I make the stop, otherwise I don't. Okay, so the results that we found were that if you made the best 6% of stops, so these are the 6% of stops which have the highest model estimated likelihood of recovering a weapon, they would actually recover 50% of the weapons. And one important thing to note is actually weapons here refers to knives and guns. Guns were much less frequently found than knives. So the best 6% of stops would recover the majority of the weapons, and the best 58% of stops would recover almost all the weapons, 90%. So the upshot is that using a model, using an algorithm, you can make a small number of well-chosen stops, and that would be sufficient to recover most weapons. So you could stop many fewer people while still reaping many of the benefits of stop and frisk. Okay, so in practice, there's this complicated statistical model that could inform police decisions. How would you implement this in the field? Well, one thing we did was we derived a very simple weighted checklist that you could also use to make stop decisions. So how does this work? Well, if an officer suspects somebody that they would have otherwise suspected, and then they say, if this person has a suspicious bulge, this is something which is marked on their form, the UF-250 form. If there's a suspicious bulge, this person gets a score of 1. If there are sights and sounds of criminal activity, they get a score of 1. And if there's a suspicious object, they get a score of 3. So an officer would compute this for a suspect, and they would say, is the suspect score above some threshold? And that threshold is allowed to vary from precinct to precinct. You know, maybe the threshold is 3 in East New York, and so if somebody has a score of 3 or above, the stop is made, and if somebody has a score of 2 or below, the stop is not made. And using this very simple 3-item checklist, we show that you only need to make the 8% of best stops to recover 50% of the weapons. So you basically add 3 small numbers, and you can use this checklist to make many fewer stops. So this is one way that algorithms could be used to inform police stop decisions. And this same methodology can also be used to audit past police actions. So there's this large data set of stops, and these stops are only supposed to be conducted with what's called reasonable suspicion, which is specific articulable facts that would cause a reasonable person to suspect criminal activity is afoot. So how do you actually know if reasonable suspicion existed in a given stop? I mean, you could look at the stop narratives, but there's hundreds of thousands of stops, right? So our idea was, you know, we estimate the likelihood before the stop is made that a weapon is going to be found, conditional on an officer suspecting that a weapon would be found in the first place. And our idea was if that likelihood is sufficiently high, let's say above 1%, then we'd say that reasonable suspicion is satisfied. And what we discovered was that many criminal possession of a weapon stops, so 43% of all CPW stops, had less than a 1% likelihood of weapon recovery, and 20% had less than a 0.5% weapon recovery. So the legal interpretation of this sort of statistical definition of reasonable suspicion is unclear. But we also noticed that the racial distribution of these low likelihood stops was skewed. So whereas only 19% of white stops were made with less than a 1% likelihood of finding a weapon, 50% of black stops had a very low likelihood, and 35% of Hispanic stops. So although the legal interpretation is clear, this illustrates that many stops were conducted on the basis of little evidence, and particularly those involving black and Hispanic residents. So if, for example, one were to use a checklist as we derive to make better stops, to not make these low likelihood stops, one could perhaps bring greater racial balance to stop and frisk. So I'd like to conclude by just mentioning some possible issues which other people have raised. So the first question is, are these tools sufficiently personalized? So do they consider relevant information in each and every case? The second issue is, how are they actually used by human decision makers? So these kind of tools are usually used to supplement human decision makers. For example, to supplement judges who are making decisions. But humans, what are the issues with human decision makers themselves? Do they use these risk assessment tools in sort of predictable ways, or are there unintended consequences, side effects? And a third big issue, this is something which has been alluded to, is just non-representative data, right? Populations change over time, data collection and recording may be systematically biased. All the data which the analysis I just showed you is based upon is based on records made by police officers after stops are conducted. And one could imagine that that data generation procedure could be biased. So, thanks.